In today's video, we're going to compare the best thing versus the worst thing about every single UFC fighter. Starting with Paddy Pimblett, the best thing about Paddy Pimblett is his popularity. Paddy Pimblett's honestly probably the biggest name in the sport right now. I'm not exaggerating. I think this guy has more buzz than Ilia Topuria, Islam Makhachev, Khamzat Chimaev. I genuinely believe if he gets one more win, or if he gets put in a title shot, it will be one of the biggest fights in terms of eyeballs watching the fight, especially for where he's at in his career. This guy's not a champion. This guy's not like Adesanya, who had title defenses after title defenses, moved up. He's still a contender. He's like ranked number 9. And I think he's in contention for one of the biggest names in the sport. But the worst thing about him is that I don't think he's good enough to live up to that hype. McGregor had that hype, how Paddy Pimblett did when they were only contenders. But the difference is McGregor was able to become champion. He was able to knock out one of the greatest fighters at the time in 13 seconds. Paddy Pimblett's not knocking out Ilia Topuria in 13 seconds. I think we can all agree on that. And not only do I think he can't beat a guy like Ilia Topuria, who's like a generational talent, but I think he really is going to struggle with top contenders at lightweight. I think Max Holloway is a huge problem for Paddy Pimblett. I think Charles Oliveira is a tough matchup for Pimblett as well. And Arman Tsarukyan, I think, is almost as sure to beat Paddy Pimblett as Ilia Topuria is. And that's the biggest problem with him, is he has all this buzz, but I don't think he's going to be able to do much with it. I don't think he'll ever be champion, at least for as long as Topuria or Makhachev or Arman Tsarukyan's around. And it seems like a Darren Till situation where he has all this hype, but he just can't do anything with it. But I think the best thing about Ilia Topuria is his entertaining style. And I think that's what's got him so much popularity. You know, I don't think it's his personality. Paddy Pimblett's personality is really what makes him a big star. I think what makes Ilia Topuria such a big star is the fact that he's knocking out these guys like Volk and Holloway and Charles Oliveira with one punch, flatlining them out cold. But the biggest problem with him is that this guy never fights. Now that he's champion, he's fighting basically once a year. He fought Volkanovski for the title in February. He fought Max Holloway in October. And then his fight after that, he didn't fight until the end of June against Oliveira. And now he's probably not going to fight until at least the beginning of 2026. This guy's talking about he wants to fight at the White House. I think he's waiting out for a big fight like Islam Makhachev. And regardless if Islam Makhachev wins or loses, that fight's going to take forever to get made. It's a big fight like Ilia Topuria versus Makhachev. It's going to take way longer than a regular title defense. And I think that's Topuria's biggest problem. Now for Islam Makhachev, I think the best thing about him right now is kind of where his career's at. Every single fight from now on is pretty much a fight that can make him the greatest of all time. If he beats JDM and gets a belt in the second division, it's hard to argue that he's not the greatest of all time. If he loses against JDM, that's a huge deal. He just got derailed. His chances of being, top 3 of all time are kind of gone unless he gets a big win against Topuria or he goes back up and wins. I think every fight now he has super high stakes behind it, and it makes his fights even more entertaining than they already are. But I think the biggest problem is the fact that he's moving up to welterweight. I know it's kind of contradictory. I just said that the fact that he's fighting welterweight makes his fight more entertaining because he could become GOAT if he wins. But I think he could become GOAT if he fought Ilia Topuria, and I think that was a much better option than moving up to welterweight. First of all, I think Ilia Topuria is an easier fight for Islam. And second of all, it's a way bigger fight. Everybody wanted that fight. Because regardless of that, if Ilia Topuria wins, he becomes the biggest name in the sport. He probably becomes top 3 at least of all time if he beats Islam Makhachev, especially by knockout. And if Islam Makhachev beats Topuria, then he's automatically the greatest of all time. Whereas he's going up to welterweight to fight JDM. If JDM beats him like I'm predicting him to do, there's not much from that. JDM's not going to be considered, an all-time great just off that. He just won the title. And he barely has any name behind him. The average casual fan does not know who JDM is. The average casual fan has heard of Topuria at least. And I think there's a lot more to lose for Makhachev going up to welterweight than he thinks. I think the best thing about Khamzat Chimaev is, since like 2021, he's probably been one of the biggest stars in the UFC. But the problem with him is that he kind of killed that off a lot with his fight against DDP. It took a lot of buzz away from Khamzat Chimaev, like really, because talk about a 180 in fight style, right? His fight before, he just dominated Robert Whittaker in the beginning of the first round, as opposed to DDP. he put on a pretty slow fight. It was a very dominant win, but it's not a normal Khamzat Chimaev performance. Because it was so dominant, it's hard for any of his other matchups at middleweight to be entertaining because there's nobody that seems like really a tough test for Khamzat Chimaev at all. So I think the way he beat Dricus is actually one of his biggest problems now. For Alex Pereira, I think the best thing about him is that in terms of upper weight class fighters, he's the most entertaining fighter by far. You have guys like Tom Aspinall who's entertaining, but Pereira just has something more. Like, they both finish their fights the same way, usually by knockout. But Alex Pereira's kind of, blown up his name way more than Tom Aspinall. He's beaten guys like Adesanya. He has the look, he has the aura. Even though he lost to Ankalaev and he's kind of lost a little bit of it, he's just the most entertaining fighter in the upper weight class. But the biggest problem is that he's probably going to get smoked by Ankalaev. There's been a lot of talk, Pereira saying that, he was at 40%. He had a lot of these things going on. He had like a broken bone or something like that. He had a sickness. But I think regardless of that, what we saw from that fight is that Ankalaev is kind of better than Alex Pereira in the boxing. And for a fight that's probably going to take place on the feet the entire time, for a guy like Ankalaev who fights with a lot of pressure and is not afraid to get in Pereira's face, especially going into the second one, it's going to be hard for Pereira to stay out of boxing range. And I think he's going to lose, and I think he's going to lose badly by knockout. And we're probably going to lose one of the biggest stars in the sport because after this knockout, he's not going to stick around at light heavyweight. He's not going to fight these contenders. He's either going to move up to heavyweight or he's going to retire. But now for Tom Aspinall, I think the best thing about him is that his skill level and just his fight style is amazing. He's one of the best fighters in the UFC right now, and he also has one of the best fight styles. He has quick finishes. But the problem with being a fighter like that, especially in a weight class that's heavyweight, there's nobody to challenge him. Kind of the same problem Khamzat Chimaev's running into. He's so good, but there's nobody to actually give him a test. At least with Ilia Topuria, he's also one of the best fighters in the UFC, but there's matchups against other best fighters in the UFC. Aspinall doesn't have that, and Khamzat Chimaev doesn't really have that unless he moves up and fights Ankalaev. So I think the biggest problem with Aspinall isn't really his own fault, but it's just the division he's in. For Sean Strickland, though, I think it's undeniable. One of the best things about him is that the build-up for all of his fights are usually some of the most entertaining build-ups. The press conferences, all that stuff is really entertaining. But the flip side of that, the biggest problem with him is that he never delivers. He's at the press conference saying that he's going to put on a war, he's going to do all this stuff, he's going to fight to the death, and we see how he fights. He throws 2 teeps and a jab per round. And for Adesanya, I think the best thing about Adesanya right now is he's one of the last huge stars of the sport. I mean, Adesanya, I think, is a bigger star than Islam Makhachev. I think he's a bigger star than, honestly, Ilia Topuria or Alex Pereira. I think the thing about Adesanya is that he gets a huge part of the casual fan base, more than these other guys. And the biggest problem with him right now is that he has no matchup that is high profile. He has interesting matchups. He could fight Sean Strickland or Paulo Costa, but when we're talking about the middleweight division and the fact that Khamzat Chimaev has no big matchup, Adesanya would be that huge matchup if he didn't get knocked out by Imavov. But right now, he's just not in the position to get these big fights and make huge, almost super fight level matchups because of where his career is going. And for Dricus du Plessis, I think the best thing about him is his fight style. He's entertaining. He's unorthodox. He always pressures forward. He's pretty much the opposite of what Sean Strickland is. But the biggest problem is that, honestly, the way he lost to Khamzat Chimaev. Like, after that loss, it's hard to believe that he's ever going to be champion again. And he's kind of eliminated from title contention. I mean, nobody wants to see a rematch between him and Khamzat Chimaev. And that almost leaves him in a position like Strickland and Adesanya where he can only have these, contender matchups because no one really wants to see them fight for the title. I think the best thing about Shavkat Rakhmonov is that he is the only undefeated welterweight right now, or at least the only undefeated highly ranked welterweight. I know there's Michael Morales, but Shavkat has that undefeated number 1 contender aura, at least a little bit of it remaining. But the problem is that it's kind of dwindling away. I think his biggest problem is the fact that he got injured. He's been out for almost an entire year. And a lot of the buzz around him got taken off by that Ian Gary fight. It was a lot closer than a lot of people expected. And it didn't really make him seem like, the boogeyman he once was, the undefeated guy, 100% finish rate. And now, going into a title fight, it's just not going to be as big of a deal as it would have been if, he got that fight against Bilal. Now for JDM, I think the best part about him is his fight style. I'm going to be honest, next to Ilia Topuria, I think those two guys have the best, most entertaining fight style I've ever seen in UFC in general. JDM's fight against Bilal was one of the most entertaining performances I've seen, one of the best showcases of boxing, the head movement, everything. But I think the biggest problem is that he's gonna derail Islam Makhachev. Unfortunately, JDM's not a huge name like Topuria, whereas if he beats Islam Makhachev, he's not really gonna become this huge megastar like if Ilia Topuria did it. So once he beats Islam Makhachev, which I'm predicting him to do, he's kind of going to take away a lot of hype from Islam Makhachev, but also he's not going to benefit too greatly from it. In terms of, his resume, it's the best thing he can do. But in terms of being a star in the sport and a big name, I just don't think, a win against Makhachev, unless he knocks him out spectacularly, I don't think it's going to do much for him in terms of star power. For Charles Oliveira, I think the best thing about him is that he's one of these big names like Adesanya, but also every single matchup he gets into, it's gonna be an entertaining fight. That's one thing about Charles Oliveira that you can't really say about a lot of fighters, is there's never really a boring Charles Oliveira fight. But I think the biggest problem with him right now is he's kind of turning into a gatekeeper. He's no longer in contention for a title shot. He lost to Islam Makhachev. He lost to Ilia Topuria badly. To get a rematch against Ilia Topuria is almost impossible for him. Say he beats Gamrot. If he fights a guy like Max Holloway, I think he's going to get pieced up. And then what happens after that? If he gets knocked out by Holloway, he waits 6 more months and he ends up fighting a guy like Pimblett? He could have a pretty bad spiral if things don't go his way. And he can turn into one of these, almost Michael Chandler level gatekeepers. Obviously, he's a lot better than Michael Chandler, but you get my point. I think that's the biggest problem with Charles Oliveira right now, is where his career is going. And for Max Holloway, I think the best thing about him is he's, I think, the second best lightweight contender right now. Behind Arman Tsarukyan, I think he's the best lightweight contender. And he's obviously super entertaining. The way he beat Poirier, the way he beat Justin Gaethje was amazing. But the biggest problem, kind of like almost every contender in the UFC right now, is he has no chance against Topuria. And especially because we've already seen him get knocked out cold by Topuria, it's pretty much impossible for him to get a title shot against Topuria unless, Topuria cleans out, Paddy Pimblett, Arman Tsarukyan, Makhachev, all these fights. Regardless, he's going to have to wait out a super long time if he even gets a title shot at all. But for Arman Tsarukyan, the best thing about him, same thing with Holloway, except he's the best contender at lightweight. He's the most deserving in terms of, his skill level and the challenge he possesses. But this guy won't fight. He had a shot against Islam Makhachev. He pulled out last minute. The doctors didn't make him pull out of that fight. He chose to pull out of that fight, and he expects the UFC to give him another title shot for free. For Michael Chandler, I think the really only good thing about him right now is he's potentially a matchup for McGregor. If McGregor ever comes back, maybe he fights at the White House, Chandler's there. Other than that, there's really nothing else. I mean, the worst part about Chandler, I think, is the fact that he can't even fight a top 10 ranked fighter anymore. I mean, he lost to Paddy Pimblett, who was ranked 13 at the time. This guy's not even capable of getting a matchup against anybody ranked, pretty much. But for Volkanovski, I think the best thing about him right now is the fact that he's just an amazing champion, and he's a huge test for any of these contenders coming up the rankings. If you beat Volkanovski, you are a legit champion and one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. But the biggest problem with him, which kind of ties into that, is that he's not getting booked against anybody. And by the time he gets booked, I feel like he's going to be too old. He's going to be more washed than he already is, if he's even washed at all. But for Gene Silva, I think the best thing about him, at least, was his fight style and his skill level. He was one of these guys that you could actually predict in a matchup with Volk to beat him. And he has that flashy style, that knockout style, great takedown defense. He's pretty well-rounded everywhere. But the biggest problem is that he got knocked out by Diego Lopes. And the problem with that is that, most people, if that didn't happen going into the next round, I think everybody would have predicted him to probably win that fight. But he went out there like a complete idiot, just hyperly aggressive, and he ran into a spinning back elbow and got knocked out. He made one of the biggest, most stupid mistakes that a fighter's made in the UFC in a while, and he paid for it horribly. And now, his chance of getting a title shot against Volkanovski is pretty much entirely gone. Now, for Lerone Murphy, the best thing about him is that, he has everything on paper. He has a good stand-up style. He's well-rounded. He's highly skilled pretty much everywhere. He has great striking. But for some reason, I just can't get hyped about a Lerone Murphy fight. Like, this guy's last fight, he got a spinning back elbow KO. And for some reason, I'm still not hyped for him to fight a guy like Volkanovski for the title. And I think that's the biggest problem with him is just for some reason, at least for me, he has no hype. Like, I don't really think that he's going to beat Volk. I don't think that, that fight's even that entertaining. I would rather see Movsar fight Volk. For Diego Lopes, I think the best thing for him is his fight style. I think he has one of the most entertaining fight styles at featherweight. The biggest problem is that he got his ass whooped against Volk. It wasn't even close. There's no, argument for a rematch. He got outclassed by Volkanovski, and, he's kind of stuck in a position where he's not going to get a title shot, even though he's kind of deserving because he just beat Silva. Now, for Merab, I think the best thing about him is his style and his skill level. He's one of these great fighters like Topuria, Khamzat, Islam, Aspinall. One of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world right now. The biggest problem is that he's almost too good. And not only that, but he won't go up to 145. I think that's the obvious thing he does once he beats Corey Sandhagen. There's no need to fight Umar in a rematch. It's been less than a year. I don't think much will change. And no one wants to see, obviously, an O'Malley rematch. The guy's way out of a title shot by now. Petr Yan, I don't think anybody wants to see that. He has no chance against Merab, at least the way I see it. The most obvious thing for him to do is go up and fight Volk. Volk is struggling for a title shot, I guess. That's a perfect matchup to make, yet Merab just will not go up and fight Volk. Now, for O'Malley, I think the best thing about him, obviously, is just his style and his name. He's probably the biggest star in bantamweight, and he has a good stand-up style. He has a lot of knockouts. The biggest problem with him is that he's never going to be champion again. No chance of going up to 145 and beating Volk. No chance of beating Merab. He's kind of stuck right now where he's going to be like a worse Dustin Poirier. And finally, for Pantoja, I think the best part about him is the same as Islam Makhachev, which is he's on the path towards becoming greatest of all time. Every fight he has brings him closer to that. But the problem is he has one more contender to fight in his division, and once he beats him, I don't think that obviously makes him the greatest of all time. A guy like Joshua Van, he's a great contender, but that's not an all-time win. And the only solution for him would be to go up and fight Merab, except, like Merab, he absolutely refuses to go up and fight him. So after he beats Van, there's really nothing left for him other than boring rematches against random contenders in the division.